She texted me at 6:12 in the morning. Hey, Martha, could you cover the countertop upgrade? Just $5,800. We want quartz this time. Let me know by noon. No, good morning. No, how are you? No, please. Just a number, just an assumption, as if I were her bank, not her husband's grandmother. I stared at the glowing screen, still in bed, still aching from yesterday's storm front. My joints had flared all night. I hadn't even had my tea yet, and already I was supposed to fund someone's dream kitchen. It wasn't the first time. Over the last 7 years, Rachel had sent me dozens of these messages, sometimes polite, often not. A down payment for the new SUV, a violin for their daughter, matching ski jackets, an emergency Botox gift card, and always with that tone, that unspoken, you owe us this. Not thank you, never sorry to ask, just you will. And for years, I did. Because I loved my grandson Aiden like breath in my lungs. Because I thought helping him build his life meant helping her too. Because I was afraid that if I said no, he'd stop calling. Which in a way, he did anyway. I climbed out of bed, slow, careful. The old pine floors in my hallway creaked just like they did in the 70s when my Harold still tiptoed out to make coffee before I woke up. I shuffled to the kitchen, boiled water, pulled down my favorite mug, the chipped one with a faded rose, older than Rachel herself. As I waited for the kettle, I looked out the window. The backyard was wild again. Dandelions like stubborn little fists. The wind had knocked over the bird bath. I made a mental note to ask Alan from next door to help me fix it. He was a good boy, Alan. Never asked for anything, but always offered. Unlike some. The phone buzzed again. Just in case you missed my last text. The smiley face did it. That smug yellow dot pasted on top of her demand. I didn't reply. I took my tea to the living room and sat in Harold's old chair. The leather one he refused to throw out even when it cracked like dry skin. I watched the light creep across the rug. I thought about Rachel's last visit. She'd come in wearing sunglasses indoors, talking on the phone the whole time, didn't even take off her shoes. Talked about investments and leveraging assets while I brought out the banana bread I'd made special. She barely touched it. She called my kitchen cute, then added, but definitely stuck in the 90s. When she left, she'd kissed the air near my cheek and called me Marfa, as if my name were just an inconvenience. Aiden hadn't even come with her, so now she wanted quartz. I opened the drawer in the side table. My checkbook was there, as always, a thick stack of duplicates behind the current one, pale blue carbon copies of every dollar I'd handed out over the years. The last page read, Sept 4, 3200, emergency dental veneers, Og 18, what 500, Taylor's school trip, educational, Og 2, $900, Rachel, just to tide us over. I looked at the empty line beneath them. I closed the book. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. Not this time. I typed slowly. Rachel, I won't be funding the countertop or anything else moving forward. Please do not ask again. I read it 5 times before sending it. I didn't want to sound cruel, just clear, honest, boundaried. A word my therapist used years ago when Harold passed and I started giving away too much. Food, time, money, love, always. I hit send. 3 dots appeared. She was typing. Then, excuse me? Then, 5 seconds later. We've always counted on your support. This is incredibly disappointing. Then, Aiden will be furious. I put the phone down. Let her rage. Let her summon Aiden if she wanted. Let him call me and say what he really thought, if he still knew how. The phone rang within minutes, his name on the screen. I didn't answer. Instead, I went to the hallway closet and pulled down the tin box labeled House. Inside were the documents I'd updated just a year ago. Deed, will, power of attorney, all still under my name. All still intact. I held the papers in my lap and thought, not with sadness, but with strange clarity. They think I'm weak, but I wasn't. I had just forgotten how to say no, eh? The last time Aiden visited me without Rachel, he brought me a pie from the store. Blueberry in a plastic clamshell container with a coupon still taped to the lid. He set it on the table like an offering and said, "Sorry we haven't been by much. Things have been hectic." I remember smiling and telling him it was okay. I told him I understood. But I didn't. That pie sat in my fridge for a week before I threw it out, uneaten. Too sweet, too artificial, like our conversations. Aiden used to visit me every Saturday after his mother died. He was 12 then, and so quiet you could hear his thoughts if you sat still enough. We'd play cards, or bake muffins, or just sit and listen to the old radio his grandfather left behind. He'd ask me things about how I met Harold, how I managed after the war, whether I ever got lonely. He'd say, "You're my best friend, Grandma." I believed him. But that version of Aiden disappeared sometime after college. After Rachel. At first, it was just small changes. Less time to talk. Calls that ended with, "Gotta run." Then it became favors. "Could you watch Taylor for a weekend? Could we borrow your truck? Could you help us out with the insurance deductible?" I said yes every time. I told myself this was family. This was what love looked like. Showing up with your wallet open. But the warmth changed, too. He started calling me Martha in public, like I was just some extended relative. He told Rachel stories I didn't recognize. How I liked things her way. How I was particular. How I didn't want too much noise. They stopped asking me to family dinners. They said it was because of the stairs. They moved into a 3-story townhouse last year. Rachel called it a modern space for a modern family. I'd paid the down payment. She never thanked me. Aiden did, once, over the phone, in a rush between meetings. I could hear him typing while he spoke. Now I sat in my kitchen, the morning after I'd finally said no, staring out at my tiny backyard with the overgrown lilac bush and the squirrels that stole seeds from the feeder. The house was quiet. The phone had stopped ringing. I thought I'd feel afraid. That Aiden would be angry. That he'd stop talking to me. But instead, there was only a low, steady peace in my chest, like the sound of the kettle coming to boil. Soft at first, then firm. At 10:30, there was a knock at the door. I peeked through the side window. Rachel. She wore a white coat, tight jeans, hair in a sleek ponytail. Her sunglasses reflected the porch like tiny mirrors. She stood with one hand on her hip, phone in the other. I opened the door, but didn't step aside. "Martha," she said, smiling like we were old friends. "Mind if I come in?" "Actually, I do," I replied. She blinked. That wasn't in her script. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," she said, lowering her glasses. Her eyes were sharp, not angry, just calculating. "I know you're under a lot of pressure, and maybe yesterday's request came off too. Abrupt." I said nothing. "We just thought, since you've been part of our financial planning before, you might want to help finish the kitchen. It's an investment in the family's future." My fingers tightened around the edge of the door. "I'm not an investment," I said. "And I'm not part of your budget." She blinked again. Then the smile came back, but colder. "You know, this affects Aiden too," she said. "You're putting him in a difficult position." "I'm sure he'll manage." And Taylor will be fine, I cut in. She has 2 parents and a brand new home. I think she'll survive. Rachel shifted her weight. Her tone changed. I hope you know what you're doing, she said. You're isolating yourself. No, I replied calmly. I'm reclaiming myself. She stared at me. I could tell she wanted to say something cruel, something final, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she turned and walked back to her car. A black SUV, spotless, leased under my name. She didn't even glance back. I closed the door, slid the bolt shut, and exhaled. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. The quiet felt different today. Not lonely. Clean. On the coffee table, my checkbook sat untouched. The pen lay beside it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel compelled to pick it up. I once believed generosity was a kind of glue, that if I gave enough, loved enough, paid enough, no one I cared for would drift too far away. Looking back now, I see how that belief hollowed me out, one check at a time. The proof sat in the drawer of my writing desk, a fat accordion folder marked Family. I opened it that afternoon, needing to remind myself why I had finally said no. Inside were years of bank receipts, photocopied checks, and handwritten notes clipped together by purpose. Each bundle carried a story I had tried to forget. The oldest was a loan for $7,500, nearly a decade ago, when Aiden and Rachel wanted to start fresh after moving in together. They promised it would be paid back in 6 months. 6 months stretched into years, then was quietly never mentioned again. Next came the medical bills. Not mine, but theirs. A hospital charge for a sprained wrist after Rachel's accident at a Pilates studio. An orthodontist's down payment for little Taylor's braces. A $200 bill for emergency dental work that turned out to be Rachel's veneers. I remembered writing that check in the middle of the night, Rachel sobbing on the phone about how embarrassed she was to show her teeth. She wasn't embarrassed enough to thank me. The folder was thickest with improvements. $4,000 for hardwood floors, $200 for a high-end washer and dryer, $600 for a wellness retreat. Rachel swore was cheaper than therapy. Every time, the same pattern. An urgent call, a trembling voice, a story about how this one expense would change everything. And every time I wrote the check, telling myself I was preserving family harmony. But harmony never came, only more requests. I turned to the back of the folder where the most recent statements lay. Just 6 months ago, $18,000, wired for the down payment on their townhouse. I remembered Aiden that day, his voice eager, hopeful. Grandma, this place will finally give us stability. We'll have a guest room for you. You'll always have your corner here. I visited once. The guest room was half storage, half office, with a folding cot jammed against the wall. Rachel gave me a tour of the new kitchen, all marble counters and stainless steel, and said, "We'll update the rest once the funds allow." I remember standing there, smiling politely, knowing she meant once you send more. That was the last time they invited me over. I sat back in my chair, the folder open in front of me. My hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't weakness. It was anger, finally having a place to land. I whispered aloud, just to hear the truth spoken. I have paid for nearly every corner of their lives, and not once did they see me as more than a purse with hands. The house was quiet, but I could almost hear Harold's voice in reply. "Edith, you don't have to keep proving yourself." I closed the folder. I had proven enough. The phone buzzed again. Aiden, this time. No voicemail, just silence after the missed call. I pictured him at work, forehead creased, Rachel pacing behind him. Maybe they were rehearsing what to say to break me back into compliance. But the truth was already here, in these documents, ink that didn't lie. I slid the folder back into the drawer and, with a kind of solemn ceremony, turned the key. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I brewed another cup of tea, carried it to the back porch, and sat in the sun without guilt. I didn't think about what bill I had to cover next. I didn't rehearse excuses to protect their pride. I simply sat, sipped, and let the warmth soak into my bones. For the first time in so long, the money wasn't leaving me. It was staying right here, in my life, where I could finally decide what it meant. And that decision, that tiny act of resistance, felt richer than any check I'd ever written. The morning after Rachel's visit, I woke up with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The house was quiet, but not heavy. More like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to take the next step. For decades, I'd let myself be carried along by other people's needs, as if I were a branch floating down a river. But that morning, I decided to plant my feet. By 9 o'clock, I was at the bank. The branch manager, Mr. Kellerman, had known me since Harold and I opened our first joint account in the 70s. His hair was white now, his glasses thicker, but he still had the same careful way of speaking, as if every sentence had to pass inspection before it left his mouth. "Mrs. Ellington," he said, rising from his chair with a smile, "it's been too long. What can we do for you today?" "I need to make some changes," I told him. My voice surprised me. It didn't tremble, didn't shrink. It was steady. He gestured for me to sit. "Changes to your accounts?" "Yes. I'd like to revoke the automatic transfers set up to my grandson and his wife. And the secondary power of attorney I gave Aiden last year, I'd like that removed as well." His pen paused over the paper. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "These are significant authorizations." "I'm sure," I said. "They were a mistake." He studied me for a moment, maybe looking for a hint of doubt. He found none. "Very well," he said at last. "We'll need a few signatures." He brought out the forms. Line after line, I wrote my name, each stroke of the pen like a nail sealing a door that had been left open too long. When it was done, he slid the papers into a folder. "All right, Mrs. Ellington. Effective immediately, no further funds will be transferred. And as for the power of attorney, it's revoked. Your accounts are under your control only. Under my control." The words sank in like a warm stone into water. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. Walking out of the bank, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not younger. I'd never fool myself into thinking I could walk back time. But freer. My shoulders lifted, my steps steadier on the sidewalk. For the first time in so long, I wasn't living as someone else's safety net. I was living as myself. When I got home, the phone was ringing. I let it. It rang again, and then came the text messages. First from Aiden, then from Rachel. Aiden: "Grandma, the mortgage payment bounced. Did you change something? Call me." Rachel: "This isn't funny. The credit card was declined at Taylor's school. You need to fix this." Aiden: "Please call. We need to talk before it gets worse." I set the phone face down on the table. For once, their emergencies weren't mine. I made tea. I sat in my chair. I opened a book I'd been meaning to read for months, one that had gathered dust while I was too busy managing other people's lives. The quiet around me felt different now. Not the silence of being forgotten, but the silence of reclaiming space. For the first time in years, the money stayed with me. The decisions stayed with me. The dignity stayed with me. And as I turned the first page of that book, I realized I hadn't just signed documents at the bank. I had signed myself back into my own life. That night, the house felt like it was holding a secret only I knew. I turned off my phone after the 20th call and set it in the drawer beside my bed. For once, I wanted silence. Not the heavy, aching silence of neglect, but a chosen silence, one I could rest in. I brewed chamomile tea and carried it to the living room. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, the same rhythm that had marked the hours since Harold brought it home 40 years ago. I curled into his old chair and pulled a quilt over my lap. The quiet was deep, but instead of loneliness, I felt a strange steadiness. Of course, my mind wandered. I thought of Aiden as a boy, how he used to leave his little shoes by the door, toes scuffed from climbing trees. I thought of him at 16, sitting at this very table, begging me to teach him how to balance a checkbook, because Dad says you're the best at money, Grandma. He'd been so proud when he mastered it. That memory stung now, like a faded scar pressed too hard. But I didn't let myself sink into sadness. Tonight was about something else. Tonight was about seeing how it felt to live without the leash of their demands pulling at my wrist. The phone stayed dark. No buzzing, no interruptions. Just me and my thoughts. I made myself a simple supper. Toast, scrambled eggs, and a tomato sliced from the neighbor's garden. I ate slowly, savoring each bite. For years, meals had been rushed affairs, grabbed between phone calls or errands for someone else. But tonight, the eggs tasted like a victory. After dinner, I took out a notebook I hadn't touched in years. The cover was worn, the pages yellowing, but it was still sturdy. On the first clean sheet, I wrote 3 sentences. I am not an obligation. I am not a purse. I am Martha Ellington, and I decide what happens to me. I stared at those words until they blurred. Then I underlined them, hard, the ink pressing deep into the paper. When I finally went to bed, the house was utterly still. For the first time in years, I didn't take my sleeping pills. I wanted to know if I could rest without numbing myself. And I did. I woke at dawn, surprised by the clarity of my own mind. No grogginess, no heaviness, just the natural ache of age and the strange lightness of relief. Of course, when I turned on my phone, the barrage returned. 32 missed calls. 15 messages. Aiden: Grandma, this is serious. We can't pay the utilities. Rachel: if you don't fix this today, we'll be in real trouble. Think of Taylor. Aiden: please, just talk to us. But I didn't answer. Instead, I went to the back porch and sat in the cool morning air. Birds sang in the maple tree, sharp and sweet. The neighborhood stirred awake, dogs barking, sprinklers hissing, children's voices echoing faintly. And me, alone, but not abandoned. Alone, but whole. For once, the quiet inside my house wasn't a punishment. It was a gift, and I held it close, knowing it was only the beginning. By late afternoon, the quiet began to shift. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was taut, like a string pulled too tight. I'd ignored the calls all day, and I knew it was only a matter of time before one of them showed up in person. I didn't expect it to be Rachel. Her car, a gleaming black SUV, swung into my driveway so fast the gravel spit against the flower beds. She didn't bother to close the door as she got out. Her heels clicked across the pavement, sharp as gunshots. I opened the front door before she could start pounding. Well, I said. That didn't take long. She shoved her sunglasses up onto her head. Her eyes were wild, glittering with fury. "Martha, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "Living my life," I replied evenly. "You cut off every transfer, every payment. The mortgage, the cards, Taylor's tuition, all declined. Do you know how humiliating this is?" I leaned against the doorframe. "I imagine it's the same humiliation I felt every time I was treated like a burden while signing away my savings." Rachel's face twisted. "You're overreacting. Families help each other." "Help," I said softly, "is not the same as being bled dry." She took a step closer. Her perfume was sharp, overwhelming, like it was trying to cover something rotten. "You don't understand, Martha. We've built our lives around your support. You can't just stop. It's reckless." "I can," I said, "and I have." For a moment, the only sound was the wind in the maple tree. Then Rachel's control snapped. "You selfish old witch," she spat. "After everything we've done for you." I laughed, not kindly. "What exactly have you done for me, Rachel? Aside from treating my home like a cash machine?" Her face went red. She glanced back at the SUV, then back at me, as though trying to decide whether to fight or flee. "Finally," she hissed, "you'll regret this." She stormed down the porch steps, yanking open the car door so hard it rattled. But she didn't leave right away. She sat behind the wheel, hands gripping it tight, staring at my house. I watched from the doorway until the engine roared and the SUV peeled backward out of the drive. Gravel sprayed again, clattering against the siding. When the sound faded, I shut the door and locked it. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from adrenaline. I'd faced Rachel before, but never like this. Never standing tall in my own doorway, refusing to budge. The rest of the evening passed slowly. I tried reading, but my eyes slid over the words. I tried tea, but it cooled untouched. The memory of her fury lingered, a storm waiting to break. At dusk, I went out back to water the lilac bush. The air was heavy, the kind of August heat that clings to the skin. Across the street, Alan was tinkering with his mower. He looked up, saw my face, and frowned. "Everything all right, Mrs. Ellington?" he called. I forced a smile. "Just fine, dear, just fine." But when I went back inside, I double-checked the locks. That night, I didn't sleep as easily. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind through the shutters, pulled me half awake. At one point, I swore I heard a car engine idling far off, but when I peered through the curtains, the street was empty. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Rachel would yell, threaten, maybe send Aiden to beg, but nothing more. And yet, deep in my chest, I felt it. The quiet wasn't holding its breath anymore. It was warning me. Rachel wasn't finished, not by a long shot. I woke the next morning with the heaviness of unease pressing against my ribs. The house felt different, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something. I moved slowly through the kitchen, making tea, but my hands shook just enough to splash water across the counter. By noon, the air outside had grown thick with humidity. Clouds hung low, dimming the daylight. I sat in Harold's chair, the one place that always steadied me, and tried to read. I didn't get more than a page in before I heard it, the low growl of an engine. Rachel's SUV. It rolled into my driveway slower this time, but no less deliberate. I stood at the window, heart pounding, and saw her grip the steering wheel, knuckles white. She didn't get out. She just sat there, eyes fixed on the house. I thought she might leave. I hoped she would. But then, without warning, she pressed her foot down. The engine roared. The tires screeched, and the black SUV lunged forward, straight at my living room. The crash was like thunder. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and the whole front wall of my house gave way in an explosion of dust and debris. I was thrown sideways out of Harold's chair, hitting the rug hard. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My ears rang, my chest burned, and all I could see was smoke and broken plaster. The SUV sat half buried in the wall, headlights still glowing, horn blaring where the airbag had deployed. Rachel slumped over the wheel, dazed but moving. My body screamed in pain, but instinct shoved me to my knees. I crawled toward the doorway, coughing on the dust. A neighbor's voice cut through the chaos. "Mrs. Ellington, are you all right?" It was Alan, shouting from outside. I'm here," I rasped, gripping the doorframe for balance. My hands were bleeding from the glass. Alan vaulted over the wreckage and pulled me toward the porch. Behind us, Rachel groaned, trying to push the airbag away from her face. Alan yelled over his shoulder, "Call 911." Another neighbor was already dialing. I could hear it. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. I sat on the porch steps, wrapped in Alan's jacket, staring at the hole where my living room used to be. My home, the place I'd tended for 50 years, looked like a wound. The police arrived first, then the fire trucks, then the ambulance. Blue and red lights painted the street. Officers rushed past me toward the SUV. "Driver's conscious," one called out. "Looks intoxicated." Rachel's voice, shrill and ragged, carried through the dust. "It was an accident. She came at me. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the sound stuck in my throat. A paramedic knelt in front of me, checking my pulse. "Ma'am, do you feel any dizziness? Any sharp pain?" "My pride hurts," I croaked. "The rest can wait." He smiled faintly, then helped bandage the cuts on my hands. The police escorted Rachel out of the SUV, her wrists cuffed despite her protests. She wore no shoes, just bare feet stumbling over broken glass. Her hair clung to her face with sweat, her voice rising to a shriek. "She's lying! She wanted this! She's trying to ruin me!" I sat silently, watching as they led her to the cruiser. Our eyes met for a moment. In hers, I saw not remorse, not even fear, only fury, wild and unbroken. The officer closed the door behind her, and the street fell quiet except for the crackle of radios. Alan crouched beside me. "You're lucky to be alive, Martha." I looked at the jagged hole in my home, the shattered remains of Harold's chair buried under rubble. Lucky? Yes. But also something else. I wasn't broken. I had survived Rachel's rage, and the world had witnessed it. And for the first time in years, I knew this fight was no longer mine alone. The police stayed for hours, measuring skid marks, photographing the wreckage, speaking into radios with clipped voices. I sat wrapped in a blanket someone had fetched from my closet, the porch railing cool against my back. My house looked like a mouth with teeth knocked out. Jagged beams, a gaping wound where Harold's chair had stood. One officer, a tall woman with hair braided tight against her scalp, crouched beside me. "Mrs. Ellington, do you have any idea why the driver would accelerate into your home?" I almost laughed. The question felt too clean for what had just happened. "She wanted my money," I said plainly, and I told her no. The officer blinked, scribbled something in her notebook, then nodded. "We'll be taking her downtown, but we'll also need your statement." I gave it as clearly as I could. How Rachel had shown up angry, how she'd threatened me, how she sat in her car glaring before slamming on the gas. My hands trembled when I spoke, but not from fear. From fury that it had come to this. When I finished, the officer touched my shoulder gently. "Do you happen to have any security cameras, ma'am?" "That footage would be important." I shook my head. "No, but Alan might." Alan, standing nearby, perked up. "I do. Got a couple mounted on the garage, covers the street and part of your front yard." The officer's eyes lit. "Would you be willing to share that with us?" "Of course," Alan said. "I'll pull the footage right now." He hurried off, and within an hour he was back, phone in hand. The officer played the clip on loop. Rachel's SUV idling, Rachel staring at my house. Then the sudden lurch forward, the violent crash. Crystal clear. No doubt, no excuse. The officer turned the screen toward me. "This alone is enough to press charges. She can't spin this as an accident, Mrs. Ellington. The intent is obvious." For the first time that day, I breathed deeply. It wasn't just my word against hers. The truth had been captured, pixel by pixel. They let me watch as they read Rachel her formal rights. She thrashed against the cuffs, screaming, "You can't prove anything! She set me up! That old hag!" The officer pushed her gently but firmly into the squad car. The door shut. Her voice cut off. The quiet afterward was almost holy. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering, pointing at the hole in my house. Some came to ask if I needed food or a place to stay. I nodded, thanked them, promised I'd be fine. My body still hummed with shock, but beneath it was something stronger. A rising current of resolve. Later, after the cruisers left and the flashing lights were gone, Alan sat with me on the porch steps. "I'll make sure the footage is stored properly. Don't you worry, Martha. She's not walking away from this." I looked at the jagged mess inside my home and felt the ache of 50 years' worth of memories reduced to splinters. But I also felt something else. For once, Rachel's cruelty hadn't been hidden behind polite words or financial manipulation. It was out in the open, undeniable, recorded for the world to see. I sipped the tea Alan's wife had brought over in a thermos and whispered, mostly to myself, "She thought she could silence me, but now her own actions will speak louder than I ever could." And I realized the fight I'd been afraid to start had already begun, and this time, I wasn't standing alone. The hospital kept me overnight for observation. My ribs were bruised, my palms cut, and my body sore all over, but nothing was broken. "You're lucky," the doctor kept saying. I knew he meant it kindly, but I didn't feel lucky. Not lying in a stiff bed under fluorescent lights with machines beeping around me. I felt tired, and strangely sharp, like the world had lost its soft edges. The next morning, the police came to take a more detailed statement. I repeated everything again, each word steady. They didn't rush me, didn't treat me like a frail old woman. They listened. That alone was a small dignity I hadn't felt in years. When they left, Aiden finally appeared. He came into the hospital room in a wrinkled shirt, his hair uncombed, his face pale. For a moment, I thought maybe he had come out of love. But then he opened his mouth. "Grandma? What the hell happened?" His voice cracked with panic. "They're saying Rachel tried to kill you. That's insane. She would never—" I cut him off. "Aiden. She drove her car into my living room." He ran a hand through his hair. "She says it was an accident. That she lost control of the wheel." I leaned forward despite the ache in my ribs. "There are cameras. Alan caught the whole thing. She sat in the car and aimed, Aiden. It wasn't an accident, and you know it. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the window. I saw it in his face, doubt creeping in, but pride fighting it. He didn't want to believe me, not if it meant facing the truth about his wife. She's under a lot of stress, he muttered finally. You cut us off without warning. The mortgage, the school bills. Do you know what kind of pressure that puts on a person? I almost laughed. Pressure makes people angry, Aiden. It doesn't make them try to murder their grandmother. His jaw tightened. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Shame. But it was tangled with fear, and that fear wasn't for me. It was for himself. If she goes to prison, his voice trailed off. What am I supposed to do? I lay back against the pillow, exhaustion washing over me. You'll manage. You're a grown man. And maybe, without me paying for everything, you'll finally learn how. He opened his mouth to argue, but the nurse came in to check my vitals, and he fell silent. After she left, he stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed. They said she'll be arraigned tomorrow, he mumbled. I'll talk to the lawyer. We'll straighten this out. I turned my face toward the window. Go home, Aiden. He hesitated, then left without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the SUV hurtling toward me, the explosion of wood and glass. I kept hearing Rachel's voice screaming, lies to the police. But every time my heart began to race, I reminded myself, the truth is on my side now. The footage, the neighbors, the broken wall of my house. Evidence that couldn't be spun into misunderstanding. The next day, I was discharged. Alan drove me home. When we pulled up, the sight made my throat tighten. Plywood already covered the gaping hole, a makeshift patch to keep out the weather. My living room looked like a boarded-up tooth. But something else waited, too. A police cruiser parked at the curb. An officer stepped out as I climbed from Alan's car. Mrs. Ellington, he said. We wanted to inform you. Rachel Ellington has been formally charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and reckless endangerment. She's in custody. I gripped the car door for balance, not from weakness, but from the force of relief. And, the officer added, she's being held without bail. The judge considered her a flight risk. Alan let out a low whistle. Sounds like justice finally caught up. I nodded slowly. For so many years, Rachel had played her games in whispers and behind doors, twisting Aiden's loyalty and treating me like an open wallet. But now, her cruelty was dragged into the light of a courtroom. The officer handed me a slip of paper. Here's the case number and the prosecutor's contact information. They may ask you to testify. I looked at the paper, then at the patched-up face of my home. My body still ached, but something inside me stood taller. I'll testify, I said. My voice didn't shake. And in that moment, I realized Rachel's war against me was finished. Now it was the law's turn. The courthouse smelled of old wood and polish, the kind of smell that clung to rooms where decisions shaped lives. I sat in the gallery with Alan beside me, his presence a steady anchor. My palms itched against the smooth fabric of my skirt, but I held them still on my lap. Rachel sat at the defense table, hair pulled back tight, dressed in beige like a woman who wanted to look harmless. Her eyes flicked around the room, but never settled on me. When she did glance my way, just once, her mouth curled in the faintest sneer. Aiden was there too, 2 rows ahead. He hadn't looked at me since we entered. His shoulders were hunched, as though the weight of shame pressed him down. But whether it was shame for Rachel or for me, Or for himself? I couldn't tell. The prosecutor rose first, a sharp young woman in a navy suit, voice steady as she outlined the charges. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, intent to cause bodily harm. Her words landed like hammers in the quiet room. Then she played the footage. On the screen, Rachel's SUV idled in my driveway. A long pause. The jurors leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Then the car surged forward, slamming into the house. Wood and glass exploded. The sound, even muted, made my ribs ache again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor said, "this was no accident. This was an attack." The defense attorney jumped up, a gray-haired man with a too-slick tie. "The driver suffered a sudden medical episode," he insisted. "She lost control of the vehicle. This is a tragic misunderstanding." The prosecutor's eyes sharpened. A medical episode that caused her to accelerate? To steer directly into a living room? Convenient. Rachel whispered furiously into her lawyer's ear, her face blotched with red. When they called me to testify, my knees wobbled, but I stood. Alan squeezed my hand as I passed. At the witness stand, I took the oath and sat, folding my hands together. "Mrs. Ellington," the prosecutor began, "can you describe what happened that day?" I told them. Every detail. How Rachel had come to my door days earlier, furious about the money. How she sat in her SUV, glaring before slamming on the gas. How the crash threw me from Harold's chair. How the neighbors pulled me from the wreckage. My voice didn't tremble. The jurors watched me, not with pity, but with respect. I saw it in their faces. They believed me. The defense tried to rattle me. "Mrs. Ellington, isn't it true you recently cut off financial support to your grandson and his wife?" "Yes." "And isn't it true that decision created tension in your family?" "Yes." "So perhaps this incident was a misunderstanding fueled by stress, not intent." I leaned forward, letting my words land clearly. Stress does not make a person aim their car at their grandmother. A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. The judge banged his gavel for silence. The defense attorney flushed and shuffled his notes. Rachel glared at me, eyes burning, but I didn't look away. Not this time. When I stepped down, my body trembled, but inside, something was steady as steel. I had spoken the truth, and no one could take it back. The session adjourned for the day. People filed out, voices low. Outside, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Aiden approached me in the hallway. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. For a moment, I thought he might finally apologize. Instead, he said quietly, "You didn't have to make it sound so bad." I stared at him, stunned. "Your wife drove a car into my home, Aiden. How exactly should I have made it sound?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His gaze dropped to the floor. He couldn't answer, because there was no answer. I walked past him, Alan steady at my side. The courthouse doors swung open, and the cool air hit my face like a blessing. For the first time in years, I wasn't just the old woman who signed checks. I was the witness, the survivor. And Rachel, no matter what story she spun, could no longer escape what she had done. The trial stretched on for days, but the truth never bent. Witness after witness took the stand. The officers who arrested Rachel, the paramedics who pulled her from the SUV, and finally Alan, who described in careful detail what he saw from his driveway. Each voice was another nail in the coffin of her story. Through it all, Aiden sat rigid in the gallery, his face unreadable. He never once looked my way. On the third day, the prosecutor revealed something new. Rachel's phone records. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, holding up the pages. On the morning of the crash, the defendant sent 3 text messages to her husband. She read them aloud, each word echoing in the courtroom. "She thinks she can control us. I'll show her she can't just walk away. If she won't pay, she won't be a problem anymore." The gallery gasped. Even the judge's eyebrows rose. Rachel shrieked, "Those were jokes. You can't take them seriously." But the jurors had already seen her face turn scarlet, had already felt the venom in those words. Aiden's head dropped into his hands. He stayed that way for the rest of the session, as though hiding from the world, or from himself. When court adjourned, I stepped outside into the damp air. The sky had opened just enough to let sunlight pierce through the gray. Alan offered me his arm as we walked to the car. I took it, grateful not just for the support, but for the reminder that some people still stood beside me without asking for anything in return. That evening, back at my patched-up house, the phone rang. Aiden. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Grandma." His voice was strained, hoarse. I don't know what to say." "Try the truth," I said softly. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry. I should have seen what she was becoming. I should have stopped it. But I need you to understand, I didn't know she would do something like this." I closed my eyes. I wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the boy who once clung to my hand at the county fair, the young man who asked me for advice before his first job interview. But the silence between us was filled with years of willful blindness. "You didn't want to know, Aiden," I said gently, "because knowing would have meant choosing. And you chose her." His breath caught. "Don't say that. I love you." I opened my eyes and stared at the fractured wall of my living room. "You love what I gave you. But me? I think you forgot how." He didn't argue. He didn't hang up either. For a moment, I thought he might cry. But instead, he whispered, "I don't want to lose you, too." "You already did," I replied, and ended the call. I sat in the silence, my chest tight but steady. For years, I'd been terrified of reaching this moment, the final fracture between us. But now that it had come, I realized something. The world hadn't ended. I was still here. My house still stood, and I still had my own life to live. Later that night, Alan stopped by with a casserole from his wife. We ate in the kitchen, 2 old friends talking about nothing and everything: the weather, the price of gas, the stubbornness of squirrels. I laughed more in that hour than I had in months. When he left, I stood by the window and looked out at the street. The shadows stretched long, but the house felt lighter somehow, as though Rachel's absence had already begun to clear the air. Tomorrow, the jury would deliberate. Tomorrow, Rachel's fate would be sealed. But tonight, I wasn't thinking of her. I was thinking of myself, and how, for the first time in years, I wasn't defined by what I gave away. I was defined by what I kept. And what I kept was my dignity. The jury didn't take long. By mid-afternoon the next day, word spread through the courthouse that they had reached a verdict. I sat in the gallery again, hands folded in my lap, while the jurors filed back into the box, their faces grave. "On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon," the foreman read, "we find the defendant, Rachel Ellington, guilty." The words struck the air like a bell. Rachel gasped, then laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "You can't be serious," she spat. "This is rigged. She's lying. I didn't mean—" The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order, Mrs. Ellington, you will remain silent." But she didn't. She thrashed in her seat, shouting, her voice echoing off the paneled walls. Two deputies moved to hold her down, and still she screamed, "She ruined my life! That old witch ruined everything!" I didn't move. I just sat and watched, steady as stone, while the mask Rachel had worn for years finally cracked in public. The judge sentenced her that afternoon, 7 years in state prison. No bail, no delay. A hush fell over the room as Rachel was led away in shackles, still cursing, still flinging blame like broken glass. Aiden stood slowly, pale and trembling, his hand reaching halfway out toward her before falling back to his side. He didn't follow her. He just stood there, looking lost. I left before he could approach me. I had no words left for him. Not then. Outside, the sky was bright and clear, as if the world itself had washed clean. Alan met me on the courthouse steps. "It's done," he said softly. "Yes," I answered. My voice felt different, lighter, steadier. "It's done." That night, alone in my patched-up house, I made myself a small celebration. A glass of Harold's favorite sherry, a plate of sharp cheddar and apples. I sat at the kitchen table and let the quiet soak in. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something quieter, deeper, relief. For years, I'd carried the weight of trying to hold a family together with my wallet, as if money could stitch respect where none existed. I'd told myself it was love, told myself it was necessary, told myself I was protecting Aiden. But love isn't something you buy. Respect isn't something you purchase. And protection doesn't mean sacrificing yourself until there's nothing left. Rachel was gone. The law had spoken. The storm that had hovered over me for years had finally broken and passed. The house still bore its scars. Plywood where a wall should be, dust in the corners, broken glass that seemed to surface from nowhere weeks later. My ribs still ached when I moved too quickly. My heart still winced at the thought of Aiden, standing alone in that courtroom, lost between his guilt and his pride. But none of that erased what had happened today. The world had seen the truth, and I had survived it. I lifted my glass of sherry toward the empty chair across the table. "We did it, Harold," I whispered. "We made it through." The house didn't answer, but for the first time in a long while, it felt alive again. And so did I. The week after the sentencing, I met with my lawyer, Mr. Duncan, in his office downtown. His shelves sagged with leather-bound volumes, his desk neat in the way of a man who had spent 40 years organizing other people's messes. He looked at me over his glasses as I slid the folder of documents across the desk. "I want to change my will," I said plainly. He nodded, already reaching for a fresh legal pad. "Very well, Mrs. Ellington. Whom do you wish to designate as your primary beneficiary?" For a moment, I hesitated. Once, the answer would have been obvious. Aiden. Always Aiden. But the image of him sitting in the courtroom, defending Rachel with silence, drifted through my mind. The boy who once held my hand at the fair was gone. The man who remained had chosen blindness, and I could no longer afford to excuse it. "My great-granddaughter, Lily," I said firmly. Mr. Duncan raised his brows. "Your late daughter's child?" "Yes, she's young, just starting out in life, and she's the only one who's come to see me simply because she wanted to, not because she needed something." He wrote quickly, nodding. "And your grandson Aiden?" "He gets nothing," I said. My voice did not waver. The words startled even me with their finality. But once they were spoken, I felt a strange freedom, as if chains I hadn't realized I still wore had slipped away. We spent the next hour discussing the details. I asked for a trust to be created, one that would shield my assets from anyone's interference. We added clauses to prevent challenges. Mr. Duncan explained everything carefully, his tone respectful, never questioning my clarity. When all was finished, he gathered the papers into a neat stack. "Mrs. Ellington, this is airtight. No one will be able to touch what you leave behind. Are you certain this is what you want?" I looked out the window at the city street, bustling with strangers who owed me nothing and wanted nothing from me. Then I thought of Lily, the way she hugged me last Christmas and whispered, "I like coming here, Grandma." "Your house feels safe." "Yes," I said. "This is what I want." He slid the documents across for my signature. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote my name, not from weakness, but from the weight of closing a chapter I had kept open too long. When I left the office, the air felt crisp, almost celebratory. I walked to the bakery down the street and bought myself a cinnamon roll. A small indulgence, one I hadn't allowed in years because I was always saving for someone else's need. I sat by the window, sipping coffee, eating slowly, and for once, thinking only of myself. That night, back home, I pulled out Harold's old photo album. Pictures of birthdays, picnics, and holidays spilled across the pages. There was one of Aiden at 6, frosting smeared across his nose, grinning at me as if I were the whole world. I touched the photo gently. "I tried, my darling boy," I whispered. "But you let her take you too far away." Then I turned the page to Lily, a baby in my daughter's arms, later a teenager with her first diploma, her smile unguarded and bright. I closed the album and felt no bitterness, only a quiet certainty. My legacy would not be a house destroyed by greed or a bank account drained by demands. It would be love, preserved for the one who still knew how to return it. And for the first time in decades, I believed Harold would be proud of me. The weeks after the trial were filled with hammers, dust, and the steady rhythm of rebuilding. Contractors patched the gaping wound where Rachel's SUV had torn into my living room. For a while, the scent of sawdust clung to everything. My curtains, my hair, even the quilt on Harold's chair. But I didn't mind. Sawdust meant progress. Sawdust meant healing. Neighbors stopped by often, sometimes just to check on me, sometimes with casseroles and pies. Alan came almost every evening, rolling up his sleeves to help carry wood or sweep debris. His wife sent over fresh bread, her way of saying, "You're not alone." For years, I had been invisible in this street, the quiet old woman in the house with fading paint. Now, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: community. One Saturday, as the new drywall went up, Alan knocked on my back door. "We're grilling tonight," he said. "Come over, no excuses." I almost declined. I'd grown used to staying in, shrinking myself into the corners of my house. But then I remembered Harold's words, the ones he used to say whenever I hesitated. "Life doesn't come knocking twice, Edith. You open the door while it's there." So I went. Alan's backyard was alive with noise. Children darting through sprinklers, dogs chasing sticks, neighbors laughing around folding tables. The smell of charcoal and rosemary drifted through the warm air. When Alan's wife pressed a plate into my hands, piled high with chicken and potatoes, I felt an unexpected lump in my throat. "Eat," she said gently. "You've carried enough weight. Let us carry you for a while." I sat at the table among people I'd known in passing for years, people who had suddenly stepped forward when my world fell apart. We shared food, stories, laughter that bubbled up like it hadn't been missing at all. For the first time since Harold's death, I didn't feel like an outsider to life. I felt part of it. Back home later, full and tired, I walked through my half-repaired living room. The plywood had been replaced with fresh walls, still bare and unpainted. I ran my hand across the smooth surface. This house had scars now, but so did I. And like me, it was standing again. I brewed tea and sat in Harold's chair, restored by the carpenters, polished until it gleamed. The clock ticked steadily in the corner. Outside, the lilac bush had started to bloom again, stubborn as ever. I thought of Rachel, locked away in a prison cell, her voice silenced by concrete walls. I thought of Aiden, drifting without her, perhaps still angry, perhaps still blind. And I thought of Lily, who had sent me a postcard last week. College is harder than I thought, Grandma, but I'm doing it. I'm proud of you. Love, Lily. I tucked that postcard into the photo album beside Harold's picture. For years, I believed my story was one of sacrifice, of giving until nothing was left. But sitting there in my patched-up home, I realized that wasn't the ending at all. This was my story now. A garden blooming again, a house rebuilt, laughter drifting from neighbors' porches, and a woman who had finally remembered that her life was her own. And it was enough. More than enough. The last coat of paint dried on the new living room wall in a pale shade of cream, brighter than the one Harold and I had chosen years ago. I stood there with a brush still in my hand, breathing in the faint scent, and thought, this house has lived through storms before, and so have I. The contractors were gone, the noise had faded, and the house was mine again. Not a wreck, not a battlefield. Just a home. My home. I made tea that evening and carried the cup to the porch. The air was cool, the lilac bush swaying gently in the breeze. Across the street, Alan waved as he coiled the garden hose, his wife laughing at something on the phone. Their ordinary life, steady and warm, reminded me how much of my own I had let slip away. I thought about Rachel behind bars. 7 years, a long stretch of time for anyone, but especially for someone who always believed she was untouchable. I wondered if she spent her nights cursing me, or if, in rare moments, she faced the mirror and saw the truth. Either way, it wasn't my burden anymore. I thought about Aiden, too. He hadn't called since the trial. Perhaps he was ashamed, perhaps angry, perhaps simply lost without someone to pay his way. For the first time in decades, I realized it didn't matter. His choices were his to bear. I had carried enough of them already. Instead, I thought of Lily, the postcard pinned to my refrigerator, the way her words glowed with sincerity. I'm proud of you. It had been a long time since anyone in my family said those words to me. They were worth more than all the checks I'd ever written. The sun sank lower, and the neighborhood filled with small sounds. A screen door slamming, a dog barking, the faint music of a radio. Life continuing. Life that I was finally ready to join again, not as an afterthought, not as a purse with hands, but as a woman who had reclaimed herself. I sipped my tea slowly, savoring the taste. For years, I had rushed through everything, meals, conversations, even moments of joy, always waiting for the next demand, the next emergency, the next bill. Now, for the first time in so long, there was nothing pressing, nothing urgent. Only the choice of what I wanted to do tomorrow. And I wanted to live, not survive. Not endure, but live, in the quiet, in the laughter of neighbors, in the letters from Lily, in the strength I had finally remembered I possessed. Rachel thought she could break me with fury, with greed, with violence. But here I was, still standing, still breathing, still free. I looked out over the street, my voice steady as I spoke aloud to no one and to everyone at once. They thought I would always give, always bend, always stay silent. But I remembered the truth too late for them and just in time for me. No one decides my worth but me. The porch light flicked on, bathing the steps in a soft glow. I finished the last sip of tea and set the cup aside. Then I added, as if sending the words to every woman who had ever been used, forgotten, or underestimated, never be afraid to say enough.